Welcome to our channel. Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when the food pyramid was basically just find something brown and hoping it doesn't bite you first. That's right, Victorian England. But not the glamorous denial top hat and cobblestone England. We're talking about the peasants, the heroes of survival, the champions of cheap meals, the inventors of culinary depression. So before you dig into this buffet of misery, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe, if you actually enjoy these weird trips through history, and leave a comment with your current snack of choice. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan for that soft white noise. Just pretend it's the sound of rats ignoring on old bread. Get comfortable and maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, something a Victorian peasant would have considered a luxury, right up there with socks that matched. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever opened your fridge and thought, is this it? Is this really all I have? Imagine that, but it's your entire life. Did Victorian peasants ever actually feel full, or was hunger just another member of the family? Did anyone really enjoy boiled cabbage, or was it a running inside joke? How many ways can you eat potatoes before you start naming them out of loneliness? Did Victorian bread really double as a doorstop? Or is that just urban legend? And what about meat? Did anyone under the age of 50 ever see it? Or was it like spotting a unicorn at the pub? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1854, deep in the back alleys of London. You're wearing the same shirt you slept in and probably will be buried in. Your stomach is already complaining and the only thing in your pocket is a suspicious turnip. Welcome to the feast. You open your eyes to the sweet, sour aroma of damp brick, overcooked cabbage and something unidentifiable growing in the corner. Breakfast is less of a meal and more of an existential question. Do you eat or just imagine eating? Welcome to the first pangs of the day. Victorian, peasant style. Your bed, if we can call it that, is really just a worn tick stuffed with straw that's seen better decades. Each time you shift, it lets out a sigh like it's just as tired as you are. Your blanket is a patchwork of every fabric you've ever owned, none of which were ever intended to match, but all of which have achieved the same shade of well-loved potato. As the sun tries to squeeze through soot-sure glass, your stomach offers its first opinion of the day, a noise somewhere between a growl and a mild complaint, like a dog that's forgotten how to bark. The first decision is whether you get up at all. Your limbs protest heavy and stiff, as you remember that sleep in a cold room only counts as rest in the loosest, most Victorian sense of the word. If you're lucky, you slept through without any rude interruptions from the local rats, who seem to believe they pay rent. If not, you probably woke once or twice to the sound of little feet, maybe even a face-to-face negotiation over last night's bread crust. You stretch and immediately regret it. The air is sharp and unkind. Your joints creak like the hinges on a haunted house, and you try not to breathe too deeply because someone is boiling cabbage 3 doors down and the smell travels faster than gossip. Still, it's time to start the day. Breakfast, technically, is calling. You just wish it would leave a message. Making your way to the kitchen is less of a commute and more of a shuffle. Your kitchen is really just a shelf, a chipped bowl and a battered kettle that could double as a murder weapon. If you're very lucky, there's a crust of bread left from yesterday, now hard enough to be legally classified as a building material. Sometimes you soften it with a splash of water. Sometimes you just gnaw and accept your fate. Luxury for a Victorian peasant is a mouthful that doesn't break a tooth. On other mornings you might get a bowl of gruel, oats, or barley cooked until it achieves the exact texture of apathy. You stir it, hoping to discover a secret ingredient, but it's always just more gruel. If you close your eyes, you can almost pretend it's porridge or pudding or something that doesn't taste like hot cardboard. Some people sweeten it with a pinch of brown sugar if they're rolling in money. You, however, make do with imagination. While you eat, you listen to the chorus of the morning, the drip of water down the inside wall, the neighbor coughing up a lung, the distant shouts of a street hawker trying to sell yesterday's potatoes as fresh. Your own family sits close by sharing the meal such as it is, while discussing the dreams they had about better meals. Someone always claims they dreamed of meat, which gets a laugh. It's like dreaming of flying to the moon. Every bite is a reminder that here, food is more about volume than flavor. Calories are currency. You eat to fill space, not for pleasure. You don't eat until you're full. Furthermore, you eat until your jaw is tired, or the food runs out, whichever comes first. If there's tea, it's weak, lukewarm, and the leaves have already done their job 3 times this week. But you cradle the chipped cup and savor the illusion of warmth and luxury, the way some people savor espresso shots in trendy cafes. Your pinky does not stick out, but your spirits try. If you're feeling extra optimistic, you peer, hopefully, into the cupboard, which is just a box nailed to the wall. Sometimes there's a miracle, half an onion, a scrap of cheese, a turnip that hasn't fully declared war on your digestive tract. You debate whether to use it now or save it for later, knowing full well that later is when you'll be even hungrier. Before you know it, the meal is done. You brush the crumbs from your lap, sigh, and get ready to face the day. You're not full, but you're not empty. That's the closest thing to satisfaction you'll find before sunset. And so you step out into the London mist, stomach rumbling, ready to chase the next bite. Hunger, after all, is just another part of the morning routine, like brushing your teeth. Except you don't do that either, and as you walk out the door you tell yourself, tomorrow maybe breakfast will be better. You know it won't, but hope, like hunger, is hard to kill. Forget soft, fluffy loaves. Your bread is basically a blunt weapon. Hard enough to break a tooth, sturdy enough to patch a hole in the roof. The trick is to soak it in something, anything. But is that tea, rainwater, or your neighbor's laundry runoff? Surprise, Victorian bread is not the centerpiece of a rustic Instagram picnic. There's no fresh from the oven aroma wafting through the alleys and nobody slicing warm, buttered hunks with a little pat on top, unless by pat you mean a small rodent. This is bread with a life cycle: Day 1, semi-edible. Day 2, roof shingle. Day 3, family heirloom or low-level murder mystery prop. You don't so much eat it as you negotiate with it. Some people have wisdom teeth. You have survival teeth honed by years of ignoring through baked concrete and hoping for the best. Breakfast begins with a survey of the bread bin, which is just a sack in the corner that also doubles as an emergency pillow. You reach in and come away with a chunk that could serve as a doorstop or, if the mood strikes, a missile to defend your cabbage from rats. You eye it suspiciously. Is that a crack? Or is the whole thing just one big crack with bread somewhere in the middle? You don't remember, and neither does anyone else. Here's the secret: Victorian bread is made to last, not because of expert preservation, but because nobody has the time, money or flour to bake every single day. Fresh bread is for celebrations, weddings, funerals, and the extremely rare Tuesday when the stars align and the bakery's fire hasn't gone out. The rest of the time you get what's left, which is usually what everyone else turned down. To make it edible, the classic trick is soaking. It's a morning ritual. You hold the crust over your bowl of weak tea, watching as it stubbornly repels liquid like an umbrella made of stone. Eventually, after sufficient time and whispered curses, the bread surrenders, turning the tea into a sort of beige stew. Other days you get creative, dunking it into broth, leftover cabbage water or, if you're living dangerously, whatever the last rainstorm left in your leaky pan. Sometimes the bread is so far gone that even soaking doesn't help. You try biting down, and your jaw makes a noise. You're sure isn't covered by Victorian dental plans. You glance around sheepishly, making sure no one witnessed your defeat. Someone always does. Your little brother, for example, is already fashioning his bread chunk into a whistle. Your grandmother claims she lost her teeth to bread like this in 1823. And frankly, you believe her if you're very lucky, and you never are. Someone remembers the trick of toasting the bread over the fire. This works exactly once, after which the bread turns into a sort of artisan charcoal, useful only for drawing on the walls or sending smoke signals for help. Still, the ritual persists. Every peasant has at least once knelt by the fire, holding a hopeful slice on a bent fork, only to produce a blackened relic that tastes like betrayal and scorched dreams. By midday, bread finds new life in the family stew. Into the pot it goes, thickening what's left of yesterday's cabbage and potato until it resembles glue. At least now it's soft enough to chew, and with your eyes closed you can almost imagine its dumpling, if dumplings were invented by pranksters. Some families even scrape the stale bits into crumbs, scattering them on top of everything as a sort of garnish. This is not for flavor, it's for morale. Bread crumbs for when you want to pretend you're climbs eating like a lord. Nothing starts a Victorian day quite like a bowl of gruel, oats, water and despair, simmered until flavor gives up entirely. You slurp it down and tell yourself, it's hearty. It's not, but at least it's warm. Sometimes gruel is one of those things that sounds almost poetic until you meet it in real life. In theory, it's simple comfort food, the ancestor of every trendy oatmeal or smoothie bowl you've ever seen on Instagram. In reality, it's more like oatmeal's sad, underachieving cousin, the one nobody invites to family reunions because he waters down the punch. In a peasant household, gruel is the answer to nearly every culinary question. Hungry group out of bread? Group, teeth hurt from yesterday's bread. You guessed it, GR. It's the Swiss Army knife of disappointment. And yet somehow it's always on the menu. Your mother ladles it out in the same battered bowl you've been eating from since you could hold a spoon. Except now, you're old enough to know that the gray film swirling on top is probably just minerals, not seasoning. Gall is an exercise in optimism. Every morning you watch someone stir a pot of water, add a handful of oats or barley or whatever is cheap and vaguely edible, and then wait for thick to happen. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you end up with something closer to oat soup, a sort of culinary dare that challenges you to pretend you're full. After 3 spoonfuls you add a dash of salt if you have it, a scrap of lard if you're feeling wild, or maybe, on very special days, a swirl of yesterday's cabbage water seasoned to taste, which is to say season until you can't taste it. The consistency of group is best described as liquid regret. It slides around the bowl, never quite deciding if it wants to be food or just a hot beverage with delusions of grandeur. If you let it cool for more than a minute, it forms a skin thick enough to patch your shoes. Kids poke at it, adults just sigh, and everyone agrees it's still better than chewing a week-old bread crust with one working MR. You eat it quickly because, frankly, the faster it goes down, the less time you spend thinking about what it actually is. You slurp not for enjoyment but for efficiency. There's no shame here. Everyone is just trying to get enough bulk in their stomach to stop the growling. For an hour or two, the family sits in silence, spoons scraping the bottom of the pot in a symphony of modest expectations. Occasionally there's a rumor that someone, somewhere, had gall with milk. This person is considered either a liar or nobility, possibly both. For the rest of you, the closest you get to luxury is the hope that today's batch is thicker than dish water. If someone drops in a bit of stale bread or a lone turnip cube, it's basically a festival. Modern diets talk a lot about clean eating and minimal ingredients. Victorian gruel is the original minimalist meal, so minimal it's barely. Even there you never have to worry about overeating. The only way you could possibly gain weight on this stuff is if you use the entire bag of oats in one sitting, which would get you thrown out of the household for reckless extravagance. Soup is the great equalizer. Rich, poor or something in between. Everyone gets watery broth filled with mystery vegetables. Sometimes there's a floating bit of meat, sometimes it's just wishful thinking. In the world of the Victorian peasant, soup isn't just a meal, it's a survival strategy. There's a kind of genius in its simplicity. Take whatever you have, put it in water and boil until edible. If you're lucky, you've got a carrot or two, maybe half an onion, and if the gods are smiling on you, a scrap of last week's turnip. If not, well, there's always cabbage, there's always cabbage. You approach the pot with a mixture of hope and trepidation. What's inside today? A foraged root, a questionable leaf, maybe a chunk of stale bread masquerading as dumpling? The broth is the color of unsure and tastes of. Let's not talk about it. You stir it with a battered wooden spoon, watching as flecks of green swirl past like they're on the run from flavor. Every Victorian peasant has at least one story about the time there was actual meat in the soup. Usually it's a legend about a holiday, a wedding, or that one miraculous day when the butcher's son tripped and dropped a sausage. Most days, though, the meat content is purely theoretical. Sometimes a small rubbery piece floats to the surface, causing the family to stare at it as if it's a comet. Arguments break out: who saw it first? Who needs it more? Who last got the lucky bite that tasted suspiciously like shoe leather? And don't forget the bones. If there's an actual bone in your soup, you treat it like treasure. You gnaw it, you suck it, you pass it around the table for everyone to try. By the time it's done, it looks less like dinner and more like an artifact. The flavor it adds to the soup is, according to some, essential, according to others non-existent. Either way, the bone gets pride of place, sometimes being reboiled in tomorrow's soup for extra value. The concept of bone broth as a health trend would baffle the Victorians. For them, it's not a luxury, it's all they have. But soup isn't just food, it's a schedule: lunch soup, dinner soup, special occasion add a little extra water and call it a stew, someone's sick soup, someone's dead. Guess what? You bring soup. If it can be ladled, it's fit for all occasions, happy or sad. Even a bad soup day is better than a no soup day. Of course, not all soup is created equal. Sometimes, if fortune smiles, there are herbs or a pinch of salt to jazz things up. On rare glorious occasions, a neighbor drops off a marrow bone or a sprig of parsley, and for a brief shining moment you understand the concept of umami. Other times, desperation wins out, and you end up boiling things that should never be boiled: nettles, old greens, or, if you're feeling risky, something you can't identify. But hope isn't poisonous. Soup is culinary Russian roulette. The real art, though, is in making it last. The pot sits on the fire all day, and as family members wander in and out, everyone adds a little water by dinner. It's more suggestion than substance, a homeopathic dose of nutrition. You call it stretching the meal, but you know it's really just defeating the laws of physics with hunger and stubbornness. Despite the disappointment, there's a strange comfort in soup. It brings everyone together, bowls in hand. You swap stories and stare into the same shared pot as if willing it to conjure a feast. Laughter is easier to come by when the alternative is critiquing the flavor. Sometimes you pretend the floating parsley is actually beefed, or you invent stories about the adventurous carrot that made it to the big city of Soup Town. Cabbage cheap filling and scientifically proven to turn any room into a Dutch oven. Whether boiled, stewed or mashed, it's the unsung villain of the Victorian diet and the main reason windows always seem open. There's a moment in every Victorian peasant's life when you realize that, barring a miracle or the unexpected generosity of a confused butcher, cabbage is about to be your primary food group. Not because you love it, nobody truly loves cabbage, but because it survives where hope and flavor refuse to grow, in the relentless drizzle of an English winter. When the fields yield nothing but mud and a potato shortage has sent the village into mourning, cabbage soldiers on quietly plotting digestive revenge. You meet cabbage at every meal, whether you want to or not. Breakfast, fried cabbage, if you can afford the fat, or just cold-boiled cabbage left over from last night's feast. Lunch, cabbage soup, cabbage hash, or if someone's feeling creative, cabbage sandwiched between two pieces of slightly older cabbage. Dinner is the same story, but colder and with even less enthusiasm. The cooking process is less culinary art and more chemical warfare. As soon as a pot of cabbage hits the stove, it declares war on every nose in a 3-block radius. The smell is legendary, a robust blend of old socks, wet compost, and something not found in nature. It seeps into your clothes, your bedding, and your soul. Victorian children grew up with the aroma as their first lullaby and their last warning before adulthood. The flavor, calling it flavor, is generous. Properly boiled cabbage tastes like sadness in leaf form. Undercooked, it crunches and squeaks in your teeth, daring you to pretend it's lettuce. Overcooked, it collapses into green mush and surrenders all dignity. It soaks up every other taste in the pot: onion, carrot, yesterday's bone, but never truly becomes anything else. Cabbage is always cabbage, the culinary equivalent of that one friend who never quite gets the hint to leave. Yet the Victorian peasant becomes an expert in disguising it. Some households master the fine art of spicing cabbage with vinegar, old bacon rind, or even a rogue apple. Others just pile on salt, hoping to trick their taste buds into thinking this is anything but a punishment. Still, every new recipe is met with cautious optimism and a certain amount of dread. After all, cabbage surprise is still cabbage. Socially, cabbage is a great equalizer. The smell alone will out anyone who's just eaten it, instantly identifying you in public as one of the well-fed, or at least the recently cabbage. People stand a little farther apart. Windows stay cracked open no matter the season. In some neighborhoods the air itself develops a faint green tinge. There's no such thing as privacy when cabbage is on the menu. There are, of course, benefits. Cabbage is cheap, almost suspiciously so, and it keeps longer than most vegetables, stubbornly refusing to rot even as it grows new life in the back of the larder. It's loaded with vitamins, or so the wise women claim, usually while pinching their noses. It fills you up without bankrupting you, and after a few meals you might almost convince yourself that you've acquired a taste for it almost. If you think today's food trends love potatoes, try eating them 3 times a day, every day, for life, mashed, boiled or raw. In moments of panic, potatoes kept Victorian peasants alive and mildly resentful. The humble potato, familiar, starchy and lumpy, was the true unsung hero of the Victorian age. No food on earth has inspired so much gratitude and boredom at the exact same time. It's the vegetable equivalent of that friend who always shows up, not exciting but always reliable, and somehow now lives in your house. Outre mornings begin with the soft, damp aroma of potatoes boiling over a smoky fire, their peels bobbing like little edible life rafts. In theory, there's versatility here. You can mash them if you have the energy, you can bake them if you're royalty and own an oven, or you can simply stare at them until they go soft enough to eat with a spoon. Most days, though, you just boil them and call it innovation. There's no butter, no cream, and definitely no chives. If you're feeling extravagant, maybe a sprinkle of salt, or if you're really living the rare appearance of a pickled onion on the side. Some dream of frying, but deep frying requires fat, and fat requires money. So Victorian chips are just a cruel rumor. The mashed version, it's basically boiled potato with a stick. You smash it, scoop it, and hope the texture makes up for the taste. Potatoes are forgiving, which is good, because they're often the only thing on your plate that hasn't been ignored by rats, claimed by mold, or boiled into a green cabbage-scented oblivion. They keep in the root cellar for months, growing little eyes that stare back at you as if to say, yes, it's us again. Sometimes you catch yourself apologizing as you peel them for the hunt time this week, but no matter how you prepare them, potatoes always come with a side of peasant nostalgia. Every Victorian child knows the potato game. How many different ways can you eat them before you start hallucinating about something else? Some families swap recipes for fun. Try mashing them with a stick of turnip. What if we added yesterday's potato? Have you ever had cold potato soup? It's like hot potato soup, only sadder potatoes even make it into dessert. Don't ask how. With enough desperation, a bit of old honey and a wild imagination, you too can convince your children that potato pudding is a treat and not just leftovers with a new name. Spoiler. They're not fooled. Despite their near constant presence, potatoes do manage to save the day in subtle ways, unlike cabbage. Potatoes don't wage war on your nose. They're bland, sure, but in a world where every other vegetable is trying to kill your friendships through the power of aroma, bland is a blessing. Potatoes bless them, keep you going, they fill your belly, they fortify your spirit, and when you're really desperate, they'll even substitute as a temporary hot water bottle. For cold feet. Don't ask, just be grateful. Still, there's a dark side to this starchy devotion. Eat enough potatoes and you develop what scientists call potato fatigue. It's when you start dreaming of anything else. You might fantasize about bread or cheese, or even cabbage, until the cruel reality of dinner brings you back down to earth, face to face with another boiled spud. Porridge is technically food, but only if your definition is something that sits in your stomach and dares you to move. It's oats, barley, or whatever grain hasn't gone moldy yet cooked into a paste so thick you could mortar a wall. In the grand culinary tournament of Victorian peasant life, porridge is the heavyweight champion of both endurance and disappointment. There's a reason it's called stick to your ribs. It's because once it's down there it isn't going anywhere soon. Some people claim it provides energy for hours, others suspect it simply weighs you down until lunchtime, so you're less likely to run away from your problems or your chores. A proper bowl of porridge is a triumph of determination over taste. The grain of choice oats if you're lucky, barley or millet if you're not gets thrown into a pot with whatever liquid is available, water, milk, yesterday's cabbage water or the faint hope of a cream splash. It bubbles, it thickens, and then it crosses a line from meal to construction material. Modern oat milks and overnight, chia bowls would flee in terror from this goofy monstrosity. This is breakfast you could travel onto bricks. Serving porridge is an art. If by art you mean scooping with a spoon that bends under the weight, you plop it into chipped bowls and hope for the best. Sometimes it sits in the center, refusing to budge, looking slightly offended to be disturbed. Sometimes it spreads out with the slow menace of an ancient glacial threatening to overtake the tableware before anyone can grab a bite. Seasoning, optional sugar, honey, or fruit are mythical luxuries you've only heard about from the neighbor who claims to have once seen a banana. Most days, a pinch of salt is as exciting as it gets. Some families add a dab of lard or a trickle of weak beer for flavor. But let's be honest, porridge has never met a flavor it couldn't overpower with blandness. It's the beige paint of breakfast foods, coating everything in sameness and lowering expectations. As for the eating part, porridge challenges you. The first spoonful burns your tongue, the next cools into edible cement, and the rest is a test of willpower. You eat it because it's there and also because it's the only thing between you and a morning of manual labor on an empty stomach, in the hierarchy of suffering. A heavy belly full of porridge beats a hollow one most of the time. Of course there are variations. Cold porridge is a special level of penance. It clings to your spoon and refuses to be stirred, much like family secrets at the dinner table. You might try slicing it like a loaf or flipping it over and pretending it's a cake. It's not, but a little imagination never hurt anyone. There are porridge hacks too, passed down from older siblings or desperate parents. Pour it out thin and crisp it in a pan for a griddle cake. Scrape the burnt bits from the bottom and call it crunchy. Add yesterday's bread crusts and tell the kids it's a new recipe. Porridge innovation is born from necessity, boredom, and a deep desire not to eat the same thing every single day, even if that's exactly what happens. Cleanup is simple. Just let the leftover porridge harden in the pot and chip it out next week with a chisel. Rumor has it some Victorian walls were held together by nothing but day-old porridge and the power of collective disappointment. Hunger breeds creativity. A leftover apple core, a crust dropped by a distracted baker, if you can grab it, it's dinner, and if you get caught, it's exercise. Running from an angry shopkeeper in the daily drama of Victorian peasant life, snacking isn't an activity, it's a survival sport. There's no leisurely stroll to the kitchen, no opening the fridge to scan for snacks you know you don't have here. The snack drawer is the street, the market, the baker's stall, and occasionally the mysterious, slightly suspicious corner behind the fishmonger's cart. If you want to eat between meals, you're going to have to work for it, usually by becoming a part-time acrobat, amateur spy, and expert in plausible deniability. The streets of Victorian London or Manchester or any other soot-stained city are a patchwork of opportunity and risk. The sharpened child who spots a dropped carrot before it hits the pulled cobblestones is a hero, at least in the eyes of any siblings who benefit from the loot. Rules are simple: see it, grab it, eat it, deny everything. But there's always competition. It's not just you and the other kids. There are birds, dogs, the occasional rat, and an army of fellow snack seekers all ready to pounce. The most classic snack to snag is the crust of bread, hard, dry, and absolutely priceless. When the baker's back is turned, and he's busy shouting at a more obvious thief, you swoop in, swipe the crust, and vanish like a magician. If you're fast, you get to eat it. If not, well, you get to test your sprinting skills, weaving through a labyrinth of market stalls and angry adults ducking behind carts and blending in with crowds. For the Victorian peasant, cardio comes free with every stolen snack. Sometimes the score is something exotic: an apple with a single bite left, a bruised pear, a handful of wilted greens tossed out by a grocer. A good day is finding a bit of cheese that's more cheese than mold, or a small fish that nobody noticed slipping out of a vendor's basket. On those rare occasions you learn the fine art of eating quickly and quietly, savoring every bite as if it's the last, because it might be. And then there's teamwork. If you have siblings, you form a snack-stealing syndicate. One distracts the baker by loudly mispronouncing the price of buns. "How much for this here, Babette?" While the other makes off with the prize. It's not elegant, but it works until it doesn't. Then you all run and the story becomes legend, retold for weeks, until someone ups the ante and claims they once stole a whole pie. They didn't. But thievery isn't always grand or glamorous. Sometimes it's simply about opportunity: finding a patch of blackberries growing wild, grabbing chestnuts from beneath a cart, or scraping crumbs from the communal table after a parish event. Anything that isn't nailed down, and even a few things that are, become fair game. You learn the subtle art of looking innocent, which usually means perfecting the 1,000 stare and a whistle that says, "Who me?" There's risk, of course, get caught, and punishment varies. The baker might chase you down with a broom or, worse, report you to the local beadle. You could end up in stocks for a day or just get a public scolding so loud your ears ring for hours. Some vendors let you go with a warning, a nod to the universal law that deep down, everyone knows a hungry kid will always try their luck. Others have less sympathy, especially if it's the third time this week. The river is polluted, the fish are suspicious, but you're not picky. Fish heads and tails, boiled, fried, or just ignored raw, are a Victorian delicacy, provided you like crunch and staring contests. In the grand hierarchy of Victorian meals, fish heads and tails are about as close to the bottom as you can get without actually eating the plate. To the well-off, the head and tail are scraps, tossed out, forgotten, or used as flavoring in a stew. But to the Victorian peasant these overlooked bits are the main event, the culinary equivalent of finding a tenner in a coat you haven't worn since last winter. And if the river's offerings look a bit more three-eyed than you'd like, well, you close your eyes and chew with conviction. Getting your hands on a fish head or tail is its own adventure. Maybe you luck out at the market catching the fishmonger in a generous mood. More likely, you're scouring the muddy banks of the Temples or the local canal, hoping for something that hasn't yet been claimed by a hungrier creature or a braver rat. Sometimes you even trade for the scraps, swapping a handful of wilted greens for what amounts to an eyeball and a dream. Preparation is less recipe and more creative problem-solving. If you've got a pot, you throw it all in with some questionable river water, maybe a slice of onion. If you're flush-boiled, it transforms into what can best be described as broth with texture. The cheeks and scraps of flesh are picked off with the patience of a surgeon and the optimism of someone who hasn't had a proper meal in weeks. Some people fry the tails, turning them into crunchy, vaguely fishy snacks. Others just go for its scales and all, hoping a good chew will sort the bones from the bites. And then there's the staring contest. Fish heads have a way of looking back at you, even from the bottom of a chipped bowl. The eyes are gelatinous, oddly shiny, and rumor has it, the source of wisdom and courage, if you can keep them down. Victorian children dare each other to eat the eyeballs, with bragging rights reserved for those who manage it without gagging or running for the door. In some households the eye goes to the youngest, both a treat and a practical joke. If you've never eaten something that stares back, have you even lived? Tails are a different challenge. Not much meat, but plenty of crunches. You nibble, you gnaw, you pretend the bones are just extra fiber. Some say chewing the tail brings good luck. Others say it brings indigestion. Either way, nobody's wasting anything, not when hunger makes even the strangest textures seem worth a second try. Of course, you don't think too hard about where the fish came from. The Victorian River is an open secret, full of laundry runoff, the occasional dead animal and industrial mysteries you learn not to question. Still, it's protein, and protein is gold. You eat what you can, hoping that the only side effect is a stronger constitution and maybe a slightly fishier aroma. Meal times are a family affair. The biggest head gets divvied up among the hungriest, with cheeks, bits of neck and the fleshy collar portion fiercely contested. Tails are passed around for crunching, with bones quietly spat into the fire or chewed thoughtfully until nothing remains but hope. The broth, itself thin and slightly gritty, is sipped with reverence, as if by consuming the essence of fish you might someday afford the fillet. You know you're desperate when dandelions start looking delicious. Foraging for wild greens is a gamble between nourishment and spending the afternoon in the nearest alley regretting your choices. For the Victorian peasant, foraging isn't a charming weekend hobby. It's a full-contact sport. Forget wandering fields in a wide-brimmed hat, Instagrammer wildflowers and sampling artisan nettle tea. This is more like a cross between scavenger hunt and Russian roulette, played in muddy boots with a growling stomach. The countryside or the nearest patch of weedy ground becomes your grocery store, your pharmacy and, on bad days, your nemesis. Every spring there's a glimmer of hope as tiny green things poke through the shoring dirt. The trouble is you have to know which greens are food and which are next week's obituary. Luckily the older folks are walking encyclopedias of questionable wisdom. Eat sorrel, not nightshade, they'll say. Dandelion leaves are fine, but don't touch the mushrooms, unless you fancy a chat with the vicar about your final arrangements. Advice that's just vague enough to keep you hungry and humble. Dandelions are the starter kit of Victorian foraging. The whole plant is edible, or so the books claim. The young leaves are bitter but vaguely nutritious. The yellow flowers go into sad attempts at wine and the roots can be roasted. If you're desperate for coffee, spoiler, it's not coffee, it's disappointment in a cup. But when you're hungry, bitter is just another word for filling. You tear off a handful, rinse them maybe, and crunch away, feeling both virtuous and slightly betrayed by nature. Nettles are next, and harvesting them requires both courage and strategy. If you're clever, you pinch them from the stem carefully, fold them into a basket and cook them to take out the sting. If you're not, you spend the afternoon with hands that tingle like you stuck them in an anthill. Cooked they taste like spinach's angry cousin. Raw, they taste like regret. There's a certain thrill to the hunt. Lamb's lettuce, wild garlic, chickweed, all treasures to the trained eye. You scour the hedge and the edges of fields, pockets stuffed with clumps of questionable green. The risk is real, one bad call and you're doubled over behind a hedgerow, contemplating your life choices and cursing whoever decided that edible was a sliding scale. Sometimes you get creative, tossing handfuls of wild greens into the pot at home. The resulting stew is vivid, sometimes sharp and grassy, sometimes slimy and suspiciously chewy. Family members peer into their bowls and whisper, "What's this one called?" You shrug, "It's green, and it hasn't killed us yet." The bar for culinary success is low, and for good reason. Berries, when you can find them, are cause for celebration. Blackberries stain your fingers and teeth with honest-to-goodness sweetness, and for a brief moment you remember what dessert used to taste like. Wild strawberries are rare, tiny and mostly fought over by the under, while elderberries go into cordials, syrups or, occasionally, accidental drunkenness. No one complains. Sometimes that's the only thing making you forget the taste of boiled nettle. Foraging isn't just about hunger, though. There's the competitive element. Who can find the biggest haul of water, crest from the stream and only swallow half the mud? Who spots the first wild apple? Who comes home with something so mysterious that even Grandma squints and says, "Well, we'll find out at dinner, won't we?" Every meal is a little bit of a gamble with survival as the ultimate prize. Meat is for the rich, for you, it's awful. Liver, kidney, maybe a bit of tripe if the butcher is in a good mood. Everything is edible if you close your eyes and chew quickly. There's a reason Victorian peasants become experts in anatomy, and it's not because anyone's getting a medical degree. When payday rolls around and you bravely step into the butcher's shop, your eyes might scan the display of plump roasts and glistening hams, but your wallet quickly reminds you to look a shelf lower down. There, hidden behind the fly swatter, is your dinner, piled in a slightly off-colored heap and sporting names that sound more like threats than ingredients. Awful, it's a lovely word for stuff the rich people don't want. Liver, kidney, heart, tripe, tongue, feet, tails, every part of the animal that isn't immediately identifiable as dinner gets bundled up, priced low and sold to anyone with courage and minimal gag reflex. In theory, it's nose-to-tail eating, in reality it's survival in a bonnet. There's a sort of ceremony to the whole affair. You approach the butcher and ask politely as you can for the bits. Maybe you're lucky and there's a fresh delivery, shiny and well, still vaguely warm. More likely, you get what's left after the local cat's been shed away. The butcher, seeing your hopeful eyes, might toss in a lung for the stew, which you accept with gratitude and a secret promise never to tell your children what they're actually eating. Cooking awful is a lesson in both patience and denial. Liver gets fried with a mountain of onions, not for taste but for camouflage. Kidneys must be soaked, rinsed and boiled within an inch of their life, and even then the house will smell like an alchemist's accident for hours. Tripe, oh, tripe requires boiling, then more boiling, then a quick prayer and then more boiling for good measure. If you're lucky and the butcher's in a generous mood, you might even get a tongue. It's not as bad as it sounds, unless you think about it. Every peasant family has their favorite awful trick. There's the mystery pie, where everything edible goes under a thick crust and emerges as dinner. Or maybe a stew, meat, vegetables, old bread and hope, simmered until the flavors blend into something you can call hearty. Seasonings are welcome, but rare salt helps. Pepper is a luxury, and if you can steal a sprig of parsley, you're living the dream. You eat nose total for a reason you simply can't afford not to. It's a strange comfort knowing you've honored the animal by not wasting a single bite. The Victorians would later claim this was traditional or rustic. You know better. It's just what happens when the only thing between you and hunger is a sheep's pancreas. There's always a family member who pretends to love offal. Grandpa insists nothing's better than fried liver. Your aunt claims tripe cured her cough. The rest of you nod politely and reach for more bread to mask the flavor. Children, for their part, are expert negotiators, learning quickly to swap their share of kidney for an extra spoonful of cabbage. The temple's home to things best left unseen. But eels are plentiful, slimy, and cheap. Mash them in a pie, add enough pepper, and you can almost convince yourself, it's chicken almost. For the Victorian peasant, eels are the river's greatest, perhaps only gift. Forget salmon or trout. Those were the stuff of fairy tales and fishermen's lies. Eels are reliable, persistent and conveniently indifferent to the color and aroma of the temps. They survive where everything else either floats away or grows legs and walks to a better postcode, which means when dinner time rolls around there's a good chance your meal is wriggling in a bucket by the door. Catching eels is an exercise in optimism. Early mornings see half the neighborhood lined up along the riverbank with baskets, makeshift traps, and the kind of determined look usually reserved for fox hunts and bread riots. Children dangle string and bent pins. Adults lay cunning baskets or just reach in bare-handed, emerging with an expression that says, "I might regret this, but hunger always wins." Once caught, eels go from slippery to sinister. Cleaning them is an exercise best done with your eyes half closed, a strong stomach and a knife you don't mind never seeing again. They're chopped, skinned and boiled until their flesh loses that characteristic ribble and the kitchen air turns thick and steamy, with just a whisper of low tide. Now the pie. Don't be fooled by the word. There is nothing sweet or comforting about eel pie, except that it's hot and filling. The eel is mixed with onions whatever greens are about, and, if you're lucky, a hearty ladle of pepper to mask the memory of the temps. The pastry, if it exists at all, is mostly flour and water, just sturdy enough to keep the eel contained and the spirits hopeful. Eel pie occupies a strange space in Victorian cuisine. It's both a delicacy and a last resort. City dwellers with more shillings than sense might order it in a tavern for a taste of the authentic poor, while those living the authentic poor just call it Tuesday. Some claim to love it most, simply love not being hungry. And so the pie is served, slices of mysterious, slightly chewy meat tangled with onions and herbs, buried beneath a lid tough enough to survive a small house fire. Then there's jellied eels, a creation so bizarre you wonder if it was invented on a dare. The leftover bits are boiled and cooled until they congeal into a shimmering, quivering dome. You eat it cold, sometimes with a splash of vinegar and a prayer that the texture doesn't haunt your dreams. The Victorians will eat anything at least once. But jellied eels are proof that culinary desperation breeds innovation and sometimes collective trauma. Other dubious delights round out the menu: periwinkles fished from the mudflats, boiled and poked out with a pin. Vocals, winkles, and whatever shellfish manage to avoid the river's daily offerings of boots and bricks. Occasionally you find a crab small enough to be adorable and just big enough to be disappointing. But if it's edible it's fair game. Still, there's a certain pride in eating what the river gives. It's food that tastes of effort, perseverance, and the kind of gritty hope that only comes from staring down a bucket of live eels and thinking, "Tonight I eat." Conversation at dinner is always lively, especially as everyone tries to guess what's in the pie and whether the recipe could be improved by swapping the temps for the Mediterranean. And when the last bite is gone, you feel a little warmer, a little braver and maybe a touch more slippery yourself. The eel pie sits heavy in your stomach, and you tell yourself you've eaten like royalty, if royalty lived under a bridge. But in the world of the Victorian peasant you take what you can get, and sometimes you even ask for seconds. Tomorrow's dinner, maybe fish heads, maybe wild greens, maybe another eel pie, who knows? In the meantime, you give thanks for pepper pastry and the persistent, mysterious creatures that call the temps home, even if you can't quite convince yourself. It tastes like chicken. You may not have sugar, milk or even much tea, but you have boiling water and a dream. Sip slowly and pretend you're in a Dickens novel, not a damp cellar with questionable company. For the Victorian peasant, tea is less a beverage and more a state of mind. The ritual is sacred: a battered kettle, a few charred sticks to coax the fire and water that, with any luck, only vaguely smells of last week's cabbage. The tea itself? Well, if you're fortunate, there's a pinch of loose leaves rattling in the tin. If you're not, you reuse yesterday's leaves or the day before, or you squint and swear. You can still see the color in the water if you hold it up to the light. Still, it's not about the strength, it's about the ceremony. In a life where most things are rationed, reused or quietly disappear altogether, the act of making tea feels almost extravagant. The family gathers around cups in hand, though. Cups is a generous term for anything that can hold liquid and not leak immediately. Maybe it's a chipped mug, maybe it's an old jar, maybe it's the same bowl you used for your porridge that morning. No one's judging. There's a certain dignity in the way the first pour is shared. Everyone receives a little, and the last person gets the mysterious dregs which are either more flavorful or just full of grit. If you're lucky, you get to see an actual tea leaf float by like a rare and beautiful bird. If not, you still cradle your warm cup and breathe in the steam, letting yourself pretend just for a moment that you're the star of your own serial novel. You look around at your family and imagine you're all living in a grand manner. If only the walls weren't crumbling and the only butler is a large judgmental rat. Sugar, that's a fantasy reserved for saints' days and the dreams of children. Milk only if the cow is feeling generous, or you have the means to stretch your weekly wages. Most days it's black tea, or gray or beige or transparent, with flavor measured in memories and hope. On the rare occasion a neighbor drops by with a lump of sugar, you carve it into the tiniest possible slivers, so everyone can pretend they live above their means. 1 cube lasts a month longer if rationed with the cunning of a master. General tea time is also story time. Cups in hand, you swap tales from work, share scraps of gossip or retell the legend of the last time someone had 2 teaspoons of tea in one pot. The older folks reminisce about when tea was a novelty, a treat smuggled in by merchants, a symbol of rebellion or respectability. Now it's a pause in the day, a brief, quiet intermission from the endless cycles of work and worry about the truly desperate. There are alternatives. Herbal tea is just a fancy way of saying whatever you found in the hero, dandelion roots, nettle leaves, even old chamomile, if you're feeling adventurous and lucky. These brews are restorative in the sense that they restore your commitment to real tea. Still, you sip them, grateful for something hot, and convince yourself that earthy is a flavor profile and not just a polite way to say dirt. In winter, tea is hope. In a cup you gather around the hearth, hands wrapped tight around whatever vessel you've got and let the steam chase the chill from your fingers and the gloom from your bones. In summer, you drink it anyway, because what's life without a routine? You toast your survival with a cup of hot water and a pinch of optimism, because, in the end, tea is less about taste and more about togetherness. It's the warmth of the fire, the comfort of company and the tiny luxury of pausing, even when life refuses to. The illusion of luxury, yes, but sometimes the illusion is enough to keep you going. So you sip slowly, savoring the moment, and tell yourself, this is the taste of possibility and with any luck there's another cup tomorrow. Water is suspicious. Beer is safer. At least it's been boiled. Weak ale or small beer is what everyone drinks, kids included. The flavor, it won't kill you, which is basically a 5-star review. If you think water is your friend, you've clearly never lived within a bucket's reach of a Victorian river in a world where the temple's more soup than stream and the local well is basically a communal science experiment. Trusting what comes out of your tap, if you have one, is an act of faith and mild recklessness. It's not just the taste, it's the invisible cocktail of parasites, pollutants and last week's surprise from the neighbors. That's why even the most suspicious beer is greeted like a returning war hero. Enter small beer, the gentle, lukewarm, barely alcoholic staple of the Victorian diet, brewed in battered cauldrons and consumed by all ages. It's less about the buzz and more about survival. Small beer is so weak you could drink a whole pitcher and remain perfectly upright. Well, unless you were already sitting, in which case you just become a little more philosophical. Its main selling point is that it's been boiled, making it more trustworthy than any puddle or pump. Mornings in a Victorian peasant household often begin with a cup of small beer, never mind that the sun isn't up, and you're about to shovel manure for a living. The children drink it, cheers to you, childhood development. The adults drink it. Even grandma has a mug, mostly because she can't remember the taste of clean water. If there's a guest, you offer them small beer and watch their expressions shift from confusion to reluctant gratitude, followed by a brief moment of existential reflection. The taste is well, it's wet, and it's not water, which is good enough. Sometimes it's vaguely reddy, sometimes sour, always flat. You might detect a hint of barley or a distant memory of hops, but mostly it tastes like the absence of death. Every batch is a little different depending on who made it, what was lying around and whether anyone bothered to clean the barrel beforehand. But it's cheap, it fills your belly, and it doesn't come with the risk of a fever or sudden dramatic weight loss. On days when the harvest is good or someone comes into a bit of extra coin, real ale makes an appearance. A darker, slightly stronger cousin to small beer. Now we're talking. Ale is the beverage of choice for the hard worker and the occasional party. The men gather at the local inn for a pint or two, swapping stories and forgetting about the endless grind, while the women sip theirs quietly at home, savoring the moment when the only thing fermenting is their patience. There are other refreshments too, apple cider if the orchard's been kind, or mead if you know someone with a beehive and low standards. Herbal infusions are common, though calling them refreshing is a stretch. Dandelion wine only if you're brave or already out of options. Sometimes someone brews a batch of something mysterious and the village waits to see if it becomes the next local favorite or a new cautionary tale. But for most, small beer is the everyday companion. It's poured into any available vessel, a wooden cup, a chipped mug, even the hollowed-out crust of yesterday's bread. In desperate times it's the fuel for fieldwork, the lubricant for long nights and the polite way to say, "Welcome to our home. Sorry about the smell." There's a comfort to the ritual, even if the flavor never quite improves. Small beer is the background music to daily life, a constant reminder that in the Victorian peasant's world, survival is built on compromise, creativity and a certain disregard for the finer things. The street hawkers' pies are cheap, greasy, and probably 50% sawdust. But when hunger strikes you're not asking questions. Just don't look too closely at the filling Victorian street. Food is a miracle of optimism and lowered expectations. The air of any city market is thick with the scent of frying fat, roasting chestnuts, questionable fish and 1,000 competing hopes that at least some of what you're smelling is actually edible. You walk through crowded alleys, pockets, empty eyes, scanning for anything that won't immediately send you to the local apothecary or the priest. Pie is the star attraction, not the kind with flaky golden crusts and bubbling fruit, but squat little domes of mystery meat, their pastry glistening with the patina of yesterday's rain and the baker's last clean shirt. You hand over a precious coin and take your chances, biting in with the kind of courage normally reserved for battlefield surgeons and chimney sweeps. The filling is always a surprise: beef if you're lucky, rat if you're unlucky, and something unclassifiable if you're just average. One thing's for certain, it's hot, it's filling, and if you close your eyes and chew fast, you might convince yourself it's something grand. Other offerings beckon from the shadows: fried potatoes, thick slices of bread slathered in dripping, the occasional sausage that could easily double as a doorstop or a bludgeon. If you're especially desperate, there's jellied eel, served cold, trembling in its own defiance of the laws of physics and good taste. Vocals and mussels sit in cracked bowls waiting for the brave or the reckless, and sometimes a hot pudding appears, its sweet scent masking a core of solid, unidentifiable mush. Risk is part of the experience. You know that hygiene is at best an afterthought. Hats are dipped for show, hands are wiped on aprons, and nobody's ever seen the inside of a health inspector's office. You choose your hawker by reputation, which is to say you follow the crowds and avoid anyone with too many pigeons hanging around their stall. The bravest souls try everything once, while the wisest stick to whatever hasn't made anyone violently ill in the last week. Still, there's a reward in the gamble. Sometimes, by pure luck or fate's good mood, you find a pie that's actually tasty, or a fried potato so perfectly crisp it makes you forget the rest of your problems, at least for a moment. It's a fleeting, greasy joy, eaten standing up surrounded by the chaos of shouting vendors, stray dogs, and 100 other hungry Londoners, all hoping for the same small miracle. Regret, of course, comes later. Maybe the filling disagrees with you or the dripping was more drip than ing. You learn the signs: the grumbling stomach, the hurried search for the nearest alleyway, the internal promise that next time you'll be more discerning. But hunger always wins, and so the cycle repeats, a bite of adventure, a dash of denial, and another story for your collection of culinary near misses. There's a social side to street food too. It's where gossip flows faster than the beer, where you swap tales of the best vendor or warn newcomers about the legendary green pie incident. Street corners become communal dining rooms where class lines blur and everyone is united by the same question: what's actually in this? Despite the risks, there's an undeniable allure to the bustle and bustle of the food market. It's food you can afford, served hot and fast in the open air, with just enough bravado to make you feel like a high roller. There's freedom in eating with your hands standing on cobblestones, laughing at the absurdity of calling this lunch. Sometimes you even find a new favorite snack, a roasted chestnut, a sweet bun, a rare sausage worth a second try. Sometimes salvation comes in a chipped bowl from the local parish. You queue with the masses for a ladle of soup so thin you can see your future at the bottom. If you want to understand the rhythm of Victorian poverty, look no further than the charity soup kitchen line. It's a daily pilgrimage for many, a slow shuffle through damp courtyards, shivering children clinging to your hem and neighbors who know exactly how many days it's been since you last had a proper meal. You try not to notice the rain soaking through your boots or the fact that the family in front of you is practicing the age-old art of counting the coins in their pockets and quietly pretending there might be enough for a second helping. Soup kitchens are an institution, a blessing and a small humiliation, rolled into one run by the local church, funded by whoever's feeling pious or guilty that week. These kitchens dole out just enough to keep starvation at bay, but never quite enough to fill you. The air is thick with the scent of boiling bones and boiled hope, both stretched as thin as humanly possible. You keep your bowl close lest it be mistaken for extra, and you keep your head down lest someone ask you what you did to end up here. As if anyone needed a reason. Inside, the scene is always the same, a weary volunteer in an apron with more stains than memories, ladling out watery broth with the ceremonial sanity of a high priest. You get your portion hot, faintly flavored, with a mysterious floating object that could be a vegetable or could be yesterday's bread. The line behind you is restless, shifting from foot to foot. No one wants to linger. The goal is simple: eat, feel something like warmth and move along. The soup itself is a lesson in creativity and restraint. Some days it's mostly potato water. Other days it's the legendary vegetable medley, meaning someone found a turnip and a carrot fighting for dominance. At the bottom of the pot there might be a single lentil bravely holding its own, or the rare shiver of actual meat if someone generous made a donation. But most days it's broth bulked up with scraps of bread or the occasional surprise ingredient. On the best days you can taste a hint of onion, on the worst you just taste yesterday. Etiquette in the soup line is its own social ballet. You don't complain out loud anyway. You nod in thanks, even if you're secretly praying. The next bowl is thicker. You swap stories about the last time you tasted real beef or who in the parish can be trusted to give an extra ladle if you look especially pitiful. Everyone has a soup strategy. The children eat quickly, the old folks savor every spoonful, and the rest of you master the slow, hopeful sip, trying to make the experience last. Soup kitchen lines are where friendships are forged and secrets are swapped. Gossip flows as freely as the broth. Who's gotten work, who hasn't? Who's ill, who's moved, who's expecting? Sometimes there's laughter, grim, yes, but still laughter, because if you can't laugh at your own hunger, someone else will. And when your bowl is empty and your belly slightly less hollow, you return your chipped vessel, wipe your mouth and step back into the world. You tell yourself you'll be back only if things get worse, though you know you'll probably be back tomorrow. It's not much, but it's hope, a thin, warm, borrowed hope, and sometimes that's enough to keep you going. No food goes to waste. Yesterday's stew becomes today's hash, the heel of bread becomes a spoon. Scraps are life, and if you're clever, so are your neighbors. Scraps in the Victorian peasant kitchen, waste is just another word for future meal. There's no such thing as throwing food away, not when every crumb is a potential lifeline and every wilted vegetable could be tomorrow's star ingredient. The law of the land is simple: if it's not crawling away, it's still edible. And even if it is crawling, well, there's probably a trick to deal with that too. Leftovers are not just common, they're the backbone of survival. Last night's stew, already a suspicious blend of old potato, cabbage and possibly something that once swam, is reheated for breakfast, thickened with a handful of stale bread or stretched with a splash of weak ale. If you're lucky, the flavors have developed, which is to say the onions have taken over and the other tastes have surrendered quietly. Scraps are treasure. The bits at the bottom of the pot, the crust of bread with just enough softness to chew the last cold spoonful of porridge. These become tomorrow's lunch. Mixed and mashed and, if you're clever, disguised as something new. A creative cook can turn the most uninspiring odds and ends into a passable meal, provided you don't ask too many questions about where the ingredients came from. Every family has their own version of hash. Into the pan goes everything: stray greens, forgotten beans, a sliver of cheese, if fortune's smiling, all fried together in a heroic act of culinary improvisation. Sometimes it's delicious, sometimes it's just food. Either way, everyone eats and the pan is wiped clean. With what else? The last heel of bread. Children become experts in the art of serging. A keen eye for dropped apples, an ear tuned to the neighbor's kitchen window, a willingness to barter half a potato for the promise of a future crust. There are unspoken rules about scavenging: never take what's not freely given, always share with siblings, and if you can trade up to a fresher scrap, you do it without hesitation. Rivalries form over the best scavenging spots, and triumph is measured by the size of your crumb collection. At the end of the day, even the local animals get in on the act. Dogs lurk under tables, cats prowl for wishbones, and the occasional clever rat makes off with a stolen bit of cheese, earning itself both curses and a kind of grudging respect. Everyone is in competition for the scraps, and the truly resourceful learn to get there first. Leftovers also build community. Neighbors trade bits and bobs, swapping a heel of rye for a spoonful of soup or a stale muffin for a promise of eggs next week if someone falls ill. The street comes together in a patchwork potluck, each household contributing a scrap, no matter how small, to make sure nobody starves. There's a certain pride in making do, in finding a meal where others see only emptiness, and when nothing remains, when the last crumb has vanished and the pot is scraped so clean, you can see your reflection. It's not defeat, it's proof of your skill. You've stretched every resource, outwitted hunger, and made something from nothing. Tomorrow you'll do it all again, because in a world built on scarcity, scraps are gold, leftovers are an art, and the truest victory isn't in feasting but in the simple, stubborn act of scraping by waste. Not want. And if you do want quietly. Someone might be listening, ready to swap you their crust for your story. Ever made a stew with nothing but onion skins, potato eyes, and regret? Welcome to Victorian peasant cuisine, where every meal is an episode of Chopped, but the basket is just disappointment. The kitchen, if you can call it that, is the stage for daily culinary improve. There's a pot, a dull knife, and a ladder. That's mostly wishful thinking. You start each meal by staring into the cupboard and hoping it blinks first. What can you make with one carrot stub, a handful of dried peas, and the lingering aroma of last week's herring? If you're lucky, you find a bonus ingredient like half a turnip or an egg. That's only a little suspicious. If not, you learn to lean on the ancient art of seasoning with hope. Every meal begins with a ritual, sorting the edible from the inedible, the possible from the illegal. Potato eyes are carefully trimmed, one for the stew, one for planting, one for good luck. Onion skins are boiled for color, also known as flavor. If you close your eyes, vegetable peelings are not trash but garnish. And if there's any lard left, you measure it with the caution of a bank clear counting gold coins. Stew, soup or hash, the boundaries blur when you're cooking. Under pressure, you toss everything in a pot and let it bubble until the flavors meld or surrender, whichever comes first. Sometimes the concoction turns out hearty and surprising. Sometimes it tastes like someone boiled a hat, but you eat it anyway because hunger doesn't have a palate. And the alternative is pretending you're on a fast for religious reasons. Desperation leads to invention. Bread too hard to bite, grate it into crumbs and call it pudding. Old cabbage wilting in the corner, slice it thin and fry it up. Then call it SLO and act like it was planned, cheese gone blue. Scrape off the worst bits and melt the rest into whatever's on the stove. If it smells edible and doesn't run away, it's fair game. Even seasoning is a creative endeavor. Salt is precious and used like fairy dust. Just a sprinkle for luck. Pepper, if you have it, turns any dish into exotic fare. Herbs and wild greens are foraged from alleys and heroes, their names often guessed, and their side effects discovered later. The line between flavorful and medicinal is thin, and sometimes dinner leaves you both full and cured, or at least convinced you might be. The real trick is presentation. You serve the meal with a flourish, describing it in glowing terms. Root, vegetable medley, you announce, as you ladle out a soup that's mostly water and optimism. Peasant pie, you say, as everyone squints at the crust and quietly wonders if that's sawdust or just finely chopped turnip. Children learn early that questions are discouraged and compliments are rewarded with an extra bite. Resourcefulness extends to the tools. If the spoon breaks, you use a stick, no bowl. Hollow out a stale bread, roll firewood running low, cook faster and call it al dente. In Victorian peasant kitchens, creativity isn't optional, it's survival. And yet there's a certain pride in making do. Every meal that emerges from nothing feels like a small victory, a triumph of stubbornness over scarcity, of imagination over inventory. Laughter bubbles up as the family gathers around the table, trading jokes about the soup's mysterious crunch or inventing legends about the lone carrot floating in the stew. Because, in the end, kitchen creativity is the ultimate superpower. You may never make it onto the cover of a cookbook, but you make dinner happen every single day. And in a world where pressure is always on and the cupboards are always bare, that's a recipe for resilience. Spoiling is a full-time job for food. If it's not salted, pickled or buried in a jar, it's probably turning green. But hey, a little mold never hurt anyone, right? Wrong? In the Victorian, peasant household, food preservation is less a science and more a desperate, never-ending battle against time, temperature and every microbe known to man. The rules are simple: eat it before it walks away, or turn it into something so salty, sour or hard that not even the bravest rat would dare try a nibble. The first and most popular method is salting. You take whatever meat or fish you're lucky enough to acquire and bury it under a small mountain of salt. The idea is to drive out every last drop of moisture, as well as any remaining hope of tenderness or flavor. A well-salted herring can survive for months, possibly years, becoming both a reliable protein source and a handy door. Stop the downside. Every meal tastes like you're eating straight from the ocean and your thirst lingers longer than your appetite. Pickling is the next line of defense. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, nothing is safe from the vinegar jug. You slice, you soak, you seal, and then you wait, watching for that magical moment when your vegetables go from about to rot to suspiciously crunchy. Pickled, anything is tangy, sharp and almost always a surprise on the tongue. Even the children acquire a taste for it, mostly because there's no alternative. The only real question is whether the jar you buried under the stairs last year will taste like dinner or science experiment. Fermentation is where things get truly exciting. You put your faith in wild yeasts, unseen forces, and the stories passed down by generations of people who had nothing else to do but watch. Cabbage bubble sauerkraut is the classic. Shred your cabbage, pack it in a crock, add salt and wait for it to do something mysterious. Some days it works, and you get a tangy, crunchy treat that wakes up your taste buds. Other days it smells like something that crawled out of the temps, and you start to question your life choices. Of course there's drying, hanging herbs from the rafters, stringing mushrooms in the window or laying apple slices by the hearth. Dried food isn't exactly delicious, but it is reliable. Rehydrating is a matter of patience and lowered expectations. A strip of dried beef in the winter is worth its weight in gold, just don't break a tooth. And then there's storing in fat, potted meats, confetti or the legendary dripping jar. Fat seals out the pot air, keeping meat fresher longer, provided nobody in the family decides to sneak a midnight snack. Nothing brings a household together like the thrill of finding a hidden spoonful of goose fat in January. Despite your best efforts, failure is always lurking. Lids don't seal, mice and insects launch nighttime raids. A jar might pop its top in the night, releasing the scent of defeat into your tiny home. And then, of course, there's mold, blue, green or black. It grows with terrifying enthusiasm. Some you scrape off, some you bravely cut around, and some you just stare at, contemplating whether hunger or horror will win. Tonight, when preservation succeeds, it feels like magic. There's a little joy in tasting pickled onions in January, or slicing dried apples for a winter tart when it fails. Well, you hope you remember the lesson for next time, and you always keep the privy nearby, just in case, because in the world of Victorian peasants every meal is a gamble. Fermentation, preservation and a healthy respect for failure are all that stand between you and hunger. And if you get it right, you just might survive until spring. Surfaced, salt-tonged and secretly a little bit proud. Once a week, if you're lucky, something special hits the table, an egg, a bit of cheese, maybe even a sliver of real meat. Sunday is when hope gets reheated. All week you eat to survive, but on Sundays you eat to remember what joy tastes like. The anticipation starts early before dawn, while the frost still clings to the windows and the smell of damp earth mingles with whatever you're burning in the hearth. The whole family shuffles about, whispering excitedly about what might appear on the table. Nobody says it out loud, of course. Bad luck tempting fate or just not wanting to jinx the rare moment when dinner is actually something to look forward to. Sunday is not just a day of rest. It's the day when rationing relaxes, if only slightly. Out comes the good crockery, less chipped, the best bread, only a little stale, and every pair of clean hands ready to assemble a meal worthy of a festival. Maybe there's an egg for each person, rare as hen's teeth and carefully boiled to perfection. Or there's a nub of cheese, sharp and crumbly divided, so precisely you'd think you were training for a career in jewelry. And then, oh the wonder, a piece of meat. Not much, mind you, sometimes just a scrap of bacon or a bit of mutton saved from the week's stew. Still, the very presence of animal fat on a Sunday plate makes you feel like royalty, or at least like you've outwitted the universe for a single meal. Preparation for a Sunday feast is its own ritual. Everything is scrubbed, chopped, stirred, and cooked with a sense of occasion. If you've managed to save a carrot or two, they get a place of honor next to the centerpiece. A roast potato glistening with borrowed lard or a drizzle of precious drippings. Children are sent to beg, borrow or barter with the neighbors for anything extra, a sprig of parsley, a scrap of onion, the memory of a spice. You make do with what you have, and then you make it special. The meal itself is eaten slowly, savored and described in loving detail. Everyone lingers over their portion, making it last, trading stories of legendary feasts, past or future. You joke about seconds, knowing full well there are never any, and the laughter makes the meal feel just a bit more filling. The food is good, or at least it's different, and in a world of endless repetition, different is almost as exciting as delicious. There's ceremony to the cleanup too. The last crumbs are swept, the best bones saved for broth, and every plate is scraped clean. For a brief moment nobody feels quite as hungry, bellies are full or as close as they get. Hearts are lighter and hope is restored for another week. Even the air feels different, thicker, with the scent of roasting, the quiet clatter of cutlery and the gentle hum of family feeling almost content. The magic of the Sunday feast isn't just in the food. It's in the anticipation, the sharing, and the reminder that even in the tightest times there's always something to look forward to. The memory of that meal lingers long after the plates are cleared, and the work week begins again. It's fuel for the days ahead, a gentle promise that the cycle will turn and with luck, next Sunday will come soon. So you lay down to sleep still tasting salt on your lips and hope in your heart. In the world of the Victorian peasant, a Sunday feast is more than a meal. It's a reason to keep dreaming. Sugar is rare, honey is expensive, but you can still dream. Maybe a plum, maybe a stale biscuit from Christmas. Dessert is mostly a state of mind in Victorian peasant life. The word dessert is less of a promise and more of a memory. For most, the idea of ending a meal with something sweet is as fantastical as being new by the Queen or finding a potato that doesn't have its own social circle of eyes. Yet the craving for something sugary doesn't care about your income or your tooth count. The first thing you learn as a child with a sweet tooth in this world: lower your expectations. Forget visions of frosted cakes, bonbons or rivers of golden syrup dessert. Here is what happens when you find something that isn't gray, green, or pickled. A single plum in autumn, unwarmed and soft, is a treasure worthy of celebration. Berries foraged from the hero are instantly fought over and eaten before they ever reach the table, and if someone in the family has a birthday, you might split a rare, rock-hard biscuit left over from last Christmas, made marginally softer by dunking it in tea for a good 10 minutes. On rare occasions someone stumbles across a windfall, literally windfall. Apples, shriveled and wormy, are gathered and stewed with a pinch of whatever sweetener can be scored up, a dab of honey if you're lucky, a spoonful of jam if you know someone with connections, or just the power of wishful thinking. Served warm in a chipped bowl, it's technically a pudding, and it tastes like autumn hope and mostly boiled apple for special holidays. The Victorian peasant kitchen becomes a laboratory of ambition. Flour is hoarded for months and a single egg is guarded like state secrets. The resulting cake is dense, chewy, and about as sweet as a brick, but you eat it with reverence. Raisins, if they appear at all, are picked out and traded among siblings with the seriousness of the stock exchange. The icing is sometimes just a dusting of flour and sugar. If anyone has some left or a drizzle of watered down so thin, it could pass for molasses perfume. Children become experts at sniffing out sweets, both literal and metaphorical. A spoonful of jam on bread transforms the entire slice into a festival. The lucky crumb of brown sugar at the bottom of the jar is the highlight of the week. Occasionally, when the mood strikes, you invent desserts out of desperation: fried bread with a sprinkle of salt, and if the stars align, a little sugar on top. You pretend it's cake and convince yourself it almost is. Sometimes a neighbor shares a pot of custard, or a cousin visiting from the city brings back a real treat. Candy wrapped in shiny paper. Too pretty to eat but too rare not to. The piece is split so many ways that by the time your turn comes it's more a whiff than a taste. But for a few moments you can imagine a world where dessert isn't a rumor. Mostly, though, sweets remain a fantasy. You end meals not with a flourish but with a sigh, and maybe a private daydream of plum pudding, lemon tart, or whatever you think Queen Victoria herself might be having at that very moment. Dessert for the Victorian peasant is an act of imagination and resilience, a reminder that sometimes the sweetest thing you can have is hope. So you brush the crumbs from your lap, scrape the last traces of jam from your plate and promise yourself one day you'll have a whole biscuit to yourself. Until then, you'll savor your dreams, your foraged berries and the tiny triumphs of making sweetness out of scarcity. 5 mouths, 1 loaf and a cabbage. You're an expert in portion control, except nobody is ever really full. Seconds is a myth perpetuated by the rich. Feeding a Victorian peasant family is equal parts logistics, negotiation, and creative accounting. The dinner table is a battlefield fought over with ladles and spoons instead of swords. Each meal starts with a quick inventory of what's left: half a loaf of bread now doubling as a doorstop, a cabbage that's outlived its welcome, and Whatever scraps have survived the relentless scavenging of the week. Everyone lines up bowls in hand, faces eager or resigned, depending on the day's luck. The process begins with rationing. The head of the household, usually whoever's tallest or loudest, serves the portions with a practiced eye. Bread is sliced so thin you can see daylight through it. Cabbage is chopped, stewed, and then spread out like you're auditioning for the job of feeding an army on a single head. You learn how to make soup look fuller by adding water, or how to cut carrots into enough slices to trick a toddler into thinking there's plenty. You become a master illusionist, conjuring abundance from absence. Meals are timed for maximum effect. You eat late to stretch out hunger, sometimes skipping lunch altogether so that dinner feels almost like a feast. The youngest are served first, both because they need it and because they're the most likely to throw a dramatic tantrum if left waiting. Adults get the smallest portions, usually under the guise of not being hungry anyway, but really because hunger is just a part of the job description. The rules of the table are sacred: no snatching, no double dipping and no arguing, at least not until after the blank plates are empty. A clever cook invents games: who can make their meal last the longest? Who can find the hidden bit of meat in the stew? There isn't any. Or who can make the loudest crunch with a sliver of carrot? Laughter is the best seasoning when there's nothing else to go around. Still, the tension is always there. You watch your siblings' bowls out of the corner of your eye, judging the fairness of every scoop. The parent in charge develops the reflexes of a hawk, catching would-be thieves and midnight snickers. With the keen sense of someone who's been there before, the family dog gets the scraps, if there are any, and learns quickly not to expect much. Even the family cat looks unimpressed by the culinary offerings. Stretching food also means stretching relationships. Families swap with neighbors: a bit of bread for a turnip, leftover soup for a promised favor, eggs for the rumor of bacon. Every deal is a tiny victory. Another day conquered in hard times. Families band together, sharing a meager meal and stories of better feasts, keeping the spark of hope burning even if the firewood ran out yesterday. Seconds is the most persistent myth. Children ask about it with the wide-eyed innocence of fairy tale believers, and parents sigh, shake their heads and point to the empty pot. On rare occasions a festival or a windfall provides a real second helping. Those are the stories that get retold for years, growing in extravagance with every retelling. The night everyone ate until they were full becomes the family legend. Half dream, half memory. And so you finish your meal, scraping the bowl for every last drop, trading jokes and crumbs and pretending to be satisfied. You go to bed hungry but not hopeless, knowing that tomorrow you'll perform the same dance, counting, rationing and stretching each scrap until it snaps. Because, in the end, feeding the family isn't about getting full, it's about getting through together, one cabbage leaf at a time. Factory bells ring, and you scarf down whatever you have, usually bread, sometimes hope, always cold. Lunch breaks are less about eating, more about not passing out. In the world of the Victorian peasant, lunch at work is more survival strategy than meal, whether you're laboring in a deafening textile mill, shoveling coal in the bowels of the city, or hunched over in a freezing workshop. Your midday break is a race against hunger and exhaustion. There's no lunchbox with compartments, no insulated thermos and certainly no ergonomic break room. There's just a battered sack or a folded handkerchief holding what little you could scavenge from home that morning. Most days you open your makeshift lunch bag to find a hunk of stale bread hard enough to chip a tooth, soft enough barely to gnaw if you dunk it in. Whatever's passing for a drink, maybe there's a cold-boiled potato. Its skin wrinkled and sad, but it fills a corner with your stomach and staves off the shakes. If it's a special week, you might have a knob of cheese thick with hope and possibly a little blue with ambition. Sweets, forget it. Even the idea of fruit feels decadent, a memory from someone else's life. The ritual of eating at work is as much about speed as sustenance. You carve out a spot among clattering machines or dusty bricks, wedge yourself into a patch of weak sunlight. If you're lucky and eat with your head down, there's always a clock ticking. The time it takes to chew through your lunch is measured against the return of the foreman's glare or the next whistle blast. Every bite is a negotiation between hunger and haste. Conversations, if you have the breath for them, drift between gossip and grumbling. Workers compare lunches like poker hands. One shows off a sliver of ham, family miracle. Another reveals a real boiled egg, inheritance or bribe. Surely mostly it's bread. All around the meal of the masses. You swap nibbles, trade jokes and pretend nobodies, counting the seconds until you're back at your post. Sometimes a kind soul brings a pot of stew left simmering on the communal fire back at the yard. Everyone lines up, tin cups in hand, grateful for anything warm, even if the meat is mostly memory and the vegetables are best described as ambiguous. On rare golden days, someone gets their hands on a meat pie from a passing hawker, splitting it into invisible slivers to be shared around the group, a gesture that's both generous and slightly heartbreaking. Hygiene is a loose concept. You eat with dirty hands, your food flavored by whatever you've been touching, grease, coal, dust, wood shavings, or hope. No one complains. Nobody expects clean. The food's gone too fast to worry about germs, and besides, a little dirt is said to build character and possibly a stronger stomach. The real challenge comes after lunch, when the food sits heavy and the work resumes. You force yourself up, muscles aching, mind already wandering to the next time you might eat. Hunger never really leaves, it just quiets down enough to let you get through the day without fainting on the job. When the bell rings again, you look around and see the same tired, determined faces, people pushing through with empty bellies and stubborn spirits. Because meals at work aren't about nourishment, they're about endurance, staying upright, keeping pace, surviving to see the end of another shift and, if you're lucky, maybe tomorrow's. Lunch will be a little less cold and a little more filling. But you don't count on it. In Victorian England, you take what you can get, scarf it down and keep going, because that's what survival tastes like: dry bread, cold potato and the faint, lingering flavor of hope. Winter arrives and suddenly food is less dull and more invisible. You ration everything, pray for spring and wonder how many ways you can cook a candle. Victorian peasants are connoisseurs of hardship, but winter is where everyone's skills and sanity are truly tested. There's a special panic that sets in as autumn winds down, when the root cellar looks emptier than a banker's heart, and you realize even the rats have packed up and left for a warmer, better stocked house. The family gathers around the ladder, counting potatoes like misers with gold, except every potato is sprouting eyes and threatening mutiny. You start the season optimistic, maybe even a little smug. Look at all those sacks of spuds, cabbages and onions safely tucked away by Christmas. You're starting to edit your recipes. Potato soup becomes potato suggestion and cabbage stew is now boiled. Air with garnish meals shrink as the days grow shorter. Lunch is often just an awkward silence and the sound of stomachs growling in three-part harmony. Rationing turns from a habit into a high art. You cut bread so thin it doubles as window glass, divide potatoes with mathematical precision and eye the dwindling supplies of salt and lard with the kind of longing usually reserved for lost love. You plan every meal days in advance, reusing scraps and inventing new ways to make thin soup taste of something other than disappointment. Sometimes you dream about feasts. Sometimes you dream about licking the mixing bowl clean. Occasionally you just dream about licking the bowl. Foraging is technically still possible, if you count ignoring on tree bark and convincing yourself that dandelion roots taste a bit like coffee. Even the family cat starts looking at the candle with interest and you wonder how many recipes there are for boiled boot leather. Answer: too many. Anything vaguely edible is a candidate for the stew pot. You reach a point where you're boiling bones for so long you start to sympathize with the bones. The physical effects creep in. Everyone is thinner, moving slower, speaking less. The cold seems sharper, more personal. You sleep to pass the time, huddled under every blanket you own, listening to the wind and pretending the ache in your belly is just anticipation for tomorrow's feast, which will be, as always, an elaborate fantasy starring bread, meat and the color green. But the worst part isn't just hunger, it's the monotony, day after day, of the same bland, thin girl. The excitement of variety fades until even a stray onion skin is enough to cause genuine debate. Do you put it in the soup or save it for garnish? Children ask questions like, will we ever eat pudding again, and you answer with the classic parental tactic, change the subject and distract them with a story about last year's legendary feast. Community spirit is tested but rarely breaks. Neighbors trade and barter, share scraps and misery and gather for shared meals that are more about company than content. Sometimes, if someone's luckier or just better at foraging, there's a surprise at the table, a handful of nuts, a dried apple, even a rabbit, if fortune smiles. And the local lord isn't watching too closely. These moments are celebrated and retold over and over, making the memory last longer than the food ever could. And then one day you spot a crocus pushing through the frost, or the sun stays up a few minutes longer and hope stirs where hunger has been. Spring brings new greens, eggs, a sense of survival. Against all odds, you pack away the last candle, unboiled this time, and remind yourself you made it through another winter, as hungry as ever, but still here. And still stubbornly dreaming about the first real meal of spring, stomach growling. You drift off on a straw mattress, hoping tomorrow brings more than boiled water. In your dreams you're at a banquet, until you wake up to the smell of old cabbage and the distant sound of rats celebrating another successful night. Nights are long for the Victorian peasant, especially when hunger joins you under the covers. Your mattress, if you're lucky enough to have one, is stuffed with straw that's been flattened more times than your spirit. Each time you turn it crackles, a crunchy reminder that comfort is for the rich and even then, probably overrated. The blanket smells like generations of soup and desperation, but you pull it up tight anyway, anything to keep out the cold, and the memory of dinner. Falling asleep hungry is its own special ritual. You lie on your back, hands over your stomach, as if you might hush the complaints. Your mind goes on a midnight tour of all the food you've ever loved, crusty loaves, warm stews, golden eggs and roasted meats. You invent new dishes in your head, inventing entire banquets you'll never taste, and for a while the dream feels real. The brain is generous that way. Generous in ways the lauder can never be. Sleep comes in fits and starts. Hunger has a way of keeping you half awake, listening to every sound, the wind whistling through broken panes, the soft drip of rain through the roof, the scrabbling of mice in the corner and, if you're truly blessed, the pitter-patter of rats feasting on something you probably meant to eat tomorrow. You can almost imagine them raising tiny toasts, celebrating their good fortune at your expense. Sometimes you wake in the middle of the night, disoriented and certain you've smelled bread. Reality sets in fast, though, as the cabbage in the corner reminds you who's really in charge. You get up, sip cold water from a chipped mug and crawl back under the covers. Hunger sharpens your senses, so you dream vividly, if not always pleasantly. Banquets turn to fairs. The table groans under the weight of impossible food, but just as you reach for the pie, it vanishes or turns to ash. Families share more than a bed. They share the struggle. Siblings toss and turn, each one hoping for morning, for breakfast, for the magic moment when an empty stomach is finally filled. Someone snores, someone mutters, someone's feet are cold and find their way to your side of the straw. Privacy is a forgotten luxury. Closeness is warmth, even if elbows and knees are at war. Beneath the covers, in these long, hungry nights, you find moments of strange comfort. Laughter bubbles up from nowhere, a joke about how thin the soup was or how today's bread could double as a shield. You trade ghost stories, share memories of meals that may or may not have happened and make up plans for the grand feast you'll have one day. Dreaming is survival? A gentle rebellion against the facts of the day. Dawn comes slowly, the light pale and watery through dirty glass. Your stomach still grumbles, but you're a little less lonely for having survived another night. You yawn, stretch and prepare to face whatever the day brings. Maybe there's something new in the pantry, or maybe not. Still, hope lingers stubborn and faint as the first rays of Sunday. You sit up, brush the straw from your hair and smile at your family, who all look as hungry and hopeful as you feel. Together you start the daily routine again, searching, stretching and making do. Because in the world of the Victorian peasant the long night may be full of hunger, but it's also full of dreams, and sometimes that's just enough to carry you through until morning. If you think modern recipe swaps are competitive, try Victorian England, where secret ingredients usually meant hiding what you accidentally dropped on the floor. Trading stew tips with your neighbor is equal parts charity and espionage. Was that nutmeg or just dirt? She'll never tell. In the cramped alleys and bustling courtyards of Victorian neighborhoods, cooking is both a public performance and a private battle. Kitchens are close together and the walls are thin, thinner still when a particularly promising aroma drifts over from next door. Every family is hungry, every pot is precious, and every cook is part alchemist, part diplomat. To swap a recipe is to reveal your hand. To keep your secrets is to keep your edge in the daily contest of edible innovation. Swapping recipes begins with casual conversation at the water pump, where the local hierarchy is established not by money or status, but by whose soup smells the least. Like disappointment. Compliments are currency. That stew. Last night my John said he could almost taste the meat in it. Oh, it's nothing, just a pinch of something special. But everyone leans in a little closer, hoping to catch the real secret behind the special. Sometimes swaps happen as acts of charity. You notice your neighbor's been boiling the same sorry cabbage all week. So you offer a tip, add a spoonful of vinegar or toss in a crust of stale bread for body. Sometimes you trade outright a handful of wild herbs for a promise of the good porridge recipe that miraculously gets the children to eat without complaint. But these trades are never as simple as they seem. Ingredients are precious, and every family has at least one secret ingredient they guard like treasure, whether it's a scrap of bacon fat or a suspiciously unidentifiable powder. From the back of the pantry. Of course, there's a darker side to the culinary exchange. Not every cook is honest and not every tip is trustworthy. Boil the nettles twice, one neighbor whispers, or else you nod, never sure if you've just been handed a recipe for soup or a cure for your enemies. Feuds flare up over accusations of recipe theft or suspected sabotage. Was that stew really as thick as she claims, or is she padding the story to hide the fact that someone dropped half the contents on the floor and scooped them up before the dog noticed? Children play their part too, acting as accidental spies reporting back on what Mrs. Parker puts in her pie or what smells came from next door's window. The keenest observers learn to identify ingredients by smell alone, a necessary skill in a world where the most reliable seasoning is usually salt and envy. But sometimes rare moments of true generosity shine through. At the heart of every neighborhood is at least one mother cook who knows how to stretch nothing into something and always has advice or an actual spare potato for a struggling family. Her kitchen is an unofficial community hub. Her recipes are lifeline at holiday times. She might even share a closely guarded cake recipe, provided you promise never to reveal the secret ingredient, which is more often than not, just a little bit of hope. Gossip and recipes blend seamlessly. Swapping a recipe is never just about the food. It's about sharing a story, forging alliances, or gaining the upper hand in the ongoing culinary Cold War. Who got the best bit of beef from the market? Who borrowed an egg and never returned the favor? Who invented that clever trick for disguising yesterday's scraps as tonight's feast? The stories circulate, grow and evolve, becoming richer with every telling. Then there are the recipe improvements. Once a tip has made the rounds, say adding a pinch of burnt toast crumbs to thicken stew, it quickly develops a life of its own. Someone swears by adding pickled beet juice, another claims the key is a bit of crushed dandelion root, and soon the original recipe is unrecognizable, each version layered with the fingerprints and floury thumbprints of every cook on the block. If it works, it's genius. If it fails, you blame Mrs. Jennings and her innovative turnip pudding, now the subject of local legend. All of this culinary intrigue takes place against a backdrop of endless want and daily hunger. Recipes are as much about hope as about flavor, an endless experiment in stretching a little further, tasting a little better, surviving with a little more pride on. Rare afternoons when a recipe swap actually leads to a meal that tastes different, maybe even good. Neighbors gather in doorways, bowls in hand, sharing bites and stories, congratulating each other on their ingenuity and luck. But even failures are shared. Burnt it again, someone laughs, passing over a consolation biscuit. You're not a real cook until you've ruined at least 3 pots. Solidarity is forged in disaster as much as in triumph, and even the most competitive cooks admit, behind closed doors, that they're grateful for every crumb of advice. That helps them make it through the week. So you swap, you adapt, you invent, and you sometimes quietly improve upon what you learn, because in Victorian England, sharing a recipe is an act of trust. And a gesture of survival. You laugh, you gossip, and you cook, always hoping your pot is the one that draws the next compliment at the water pump, even if the secret ingredient is still mostly dirt in the end, whether it's nutmeg hope or a speck of actual meat. You hold your culinary secrets close, just close enough to trade and just far enough to keep your edge in the never-ending game of edible unupmanship. No matter how tightly you seal your bread, the rats are better at food storage than you are. At night, you hear them scurrying, having a feast with more variety than you've seen all year. Sometimes you wonder if you could catch one for your own stew or if that's a recipe for a haunting. The Victorian peasant struggle with rats is a tale as old as bread itself. You can cover your bread with a bowl, tie up your flour in a sack and dangle your cheese from the rafters, but the rats always find a way. If you listen at night you'll hear the secret life of the kitchen, the pitter-patter of tiny paws, the ignoring of teeth sharp enough to cut through nearly anything, and the occasional triumphant squeak as another crumb falls to the dark side. The rats are not just surviving, they're thriving, hosting midnight banquets in the spaces between the walls and under the floorboards, often with better attendance than your last Sunday dinner. By day, you do your best to pretend they don't exist. You patch the holes, set traps with the optimism of a lottery player and occasionally launch a broom-based assault on the latter. But for every rat you see there are at least 5 more waiting in the wings, ready to snatch any stray morsel or leftover scrap. Some families try to keep a cat, but even the boldest feline eventually learns that the rats are not just competitors. They're the shadow government of your pantry. The cleverest rats are legends known by name and reputation. Old Scarback with his missing ear, who's been outsmarting the family for years. Little Queenie, who once dragged a boiled potato up 3 flights of stairs without being caught. You tell stories of their exploits as if they're cunning anti-heroes. Instead of the reason your bread now comes with a side of teeth marks, you develop rituals to protect your food, hang your bread in a bag from a hook, wedge your cheese in a tin with a rock on top or, in truly desperate times, sleep with your potato sack under your pillow. Of course the rats see this as a challenge. By morning, you discover the sack ignored open, the bread missing and the family cat pointedly looking the other way. You make peace with the fact that some of what you cook will always be for the rats. The children are both terrified and fascinated. They compete to spot the most rats in a single night, and some even lay tiny traps made of string and wishful thinking. On especially hungry days you catch yourself eyeing the biggest rat and calculating just for a moment whether a rat stew is really out of the question. But even desperation has its limits. Nobody wants to be the first family on the street known for eating the local rat king. Meanwhile, the rat's boldness grows. They skitter across tables, peek out from cracks and occasionally stare you down as if to say, "What else have you got?" It's hard not to take it personally. You fantasize about outsmarting them, launching a rodent-based coup that finally leaves your pantry safe. But deep down you know that the rats were here before you and they'll be here long after you've eaten your last crust. Rats are resourceful, almost admirable, if you ignore the teeth marks on your only decent loaf. They move in at the first sign of warmth or crumbs, raise families with reckless abandon and seem to know exactly when the bread is freshest. Some nights you lie awake listening to their secret parties and imagine them critiquing your kitchen skills tonight. A delightful crust, notes of rye, a slight hint of lard, compliments to the chef. They're the original food critics and, unlike your in-laws, they never wait for an invitation. Sometimes you find yourself developing a strange respect for your furry foes. They've survived plagues, poisons, and the angry boot of every generation before you. They know more about survival than half the humans on the street. Furthermore, they're social, loyal to each other at least, and endlessly inventive. If only you could put their skills to work. Imagine old Scar back as head of pantry security or Little Queen as the bread keeper. But ultimately the peace is uneasy and the battle never truly ends. Some nights the rats win. They get the best scraps, the choicest crumbs and the warmest corner by the fire. Other nights you manage to hold on to your meager store and go to bed with a sense of triumph, however fleeting. So you tuck your bread away, say a little prayer and hope tonight's feast belongs to you, not the rats. But if it doesn't, at least you're in good company. After all, survival-like dinner is best shared, even if it's with a crowd you'd never invite. And in the dark of the Victorian night, as you and the rats settle in for another round, you can almost laugh because at least someone's eating well. Victorian meat pies are a culinary lottery. Sometimes there's meat, sometimes it's a creative reinterpretation of beef. You bite in with hope, chew with suspicion and swallow with resignation. If it's chewy and doesn't bite back, you call it dinner and don't ask follow-up questions. There's no food more iconic or more misunderstood on a Victorian street corner than the humble meat pie stacked high in a baker's window. These hand-sized miracles promise everything: comfort, warmth and the possibility of protein. The crust is golden, or at least golden brownish, sometimes flaking, sometimes harder than the cobblestones outside. You hand over your hard-earned coin, holding your breath in anticipation and, if you're wise to mask the smell inside, the adventure begins. Some days the filling is undeniably meaty, chunks of something that once had legs, possibly even 4, nestled in a gravy so thick you could mortar a wall with it. These are the legendary pies, the ones you'll tell your grandchildren about the night I had 2 bites of actual beef. More often, though, you're greeted by a mysterious mixture, a few tough slivers, a lot of gravy and the sinking suspicion that something with fur or feathers recently lost its way near the pie shop. The less fortunate pies, those sold late in the day or by vendors with more imagination than scruples, offer fillings that stretch the definition of edible. Maybe you get gristle tendon or chef surprise, which could mean anything from organ meats to yesterday's leftovers. The bravest souls claim to have found vegetables in theirs: turnip, carrot, a lone pea clinging to life, but mostly you get texture, chewy, stringy and just a little bit questionable. The true gamble, however, is never in the taste, it's in the provenance. Where did this meat come from? You don't ask, and the pie man doesn't tell. Maybe it was swept off the butcher's floor, maybe it's whatever, couldn't outrun the cook this morning. Urban legends abound: someone found a pigeon foot, another swore there was a wishbone, and every child knows a story about the pie filled with cat. Whether or not these tales are true, everyone agrees: never look too closely at what's inside. Ignorance, in this case, is the best seasoning. You learn to identify the best pie sellers by reputation, not by sign. Word spreads quickly when a batch is especially beefy or heaven forbid off. The crowds gather, pies disappear, and for a brief moment everyone is united by the shared hope that tonight's dinner is more cow than calamity. The unlucky trudge home with a pie that's mostly crust, muttering under their breath and promising to try the other vendor tomorrow. At home, meat pies are more DIY. You save scraps of whatever you have, add a handful of stale breadcrumbs, a splash of thin gravy and anything that passes for seasoning, ease it all in a tough dough and bake it until even the rats look envious. Children squint at the filling, adults warn them not to complain, and everyone agrees: as long as it's hot, and you don't break a tooth, it counts as a meal. There's a strange camaraderie in meat pie roulette. The act of eating one is half dinner, half dare. A ritual where everyone's in on the joke and nobody expects too much. You eat quickly, thank the universe for the protein, real or theoretical, and hope that tomorrow's pie will be just a little less mysterious. And so you finish your last bite, wipe the gravy from your chin and let out a sigh of satisfaction, resignation, or possibly relief. Another day, another mystery solved, or at least another dinner survived. Because in Victorian England sometimes the only thing thicker than the gravy is the plot. There's nothing like a holiday to raise culinary spirits and expectations. On festival days, the street fills with smells you barely remember: roasted chestnuts, sweet buns and things wrapped in pastry. You line up for a taste, knowing the next one might be a year and a small miracle away. There's nothing like a holiday to raise culinary spirits and expectations. On festival days, the street fills with smells you barely remember: roasted chestnuts, sweet buns and things wrapped in pastry. You line up for a taste, knowing the next one might be a year and a small miracle away. In Victorian England, festival days are the dazzling punctuation marks in an otherwise endless sentence of boiled cabbage and gruel. For the rest of the year you eat to survive, to stretch another day, to fill your belly with anything warm and vaguely edible. But when a festival comes around, you're allowed to eat, to celebrate, to hope and, just for an afternoon, to remember that food can be about joy as much as survival. Preparation begins long before the first bun appears. The whole family saves every stray farthing, stashes away eggs and flour and whispers strategic plans for getting the best spot in the line when the vendors roll out their carts. If someone in the house can sweet-talk a baker or run errands for a street hawker, so much the better. Every scrap of goodwill is traded for the prospect of a festival treat. The morning of the festival dawned differently. People are out in the streets early, washing faces and scrubbing boots, children in their best, the least patched shirts, mothers with a hopeful gleam in their eyes. Fathers look less worried, if only for a day. Even the air feels lighter, humming with the excitement of possibility. The main event is the parade of food. You follow your nose through the press of neighbors, weaving between stalls piled high with golden, sweet buns, rows of meat pies, towers of bright, sticky candy apples, and sausages sizzling on open grills. Roasted chestnuts spill out of brown paper, filling your hands with warmth and your mouth with something richer than most Sunday dinners. There are pastries glistening with sugar, lardy cakes, puddings that wobble with the promise of actual fruit and, if you're very lucky, a savory pie that isn't mostly air and yesterday's gravy. You know you're gambling with your entire weekly budget, but you hand over your coin anyway. Today is not for saving. Today is for remembering what food can do to a soul starved of everything but routine. You eat your buns, slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be your last, which, given the price of yeast and raisins, is entirely possible. Children run wild, faces smudged with jam, clutching sticky remnants of sweets that might last the afternoon. If they ration carefully, spoiler they won't. Every treat is a treasure. Toffee sticks to teeth and lips, tiny cakes disappear in 2 bites and the daring few try everything, racing from pie to pie in a sugar-fueled haze. There's a social aspect too. Festival food is for sharing, if not the actual bun, then at least the memory of how it tasted. Neighbors swap bites and stories, promising to trade next year if one household gets luckier with the coins. People who barely nod to each other on the street most days are suddenly swapping tips on where to find the best pudding or debating the virtues of one street hawker's sausage over another. The feast is communal. Laughter and gossip are the unspoken sides. But festival fare is also about longing. The abundance on offer throws the rest of the year's meals into sharp relief. You can't help but compare the soft crumb of a sweet bun to the dense, dry bricks you usually call bread, or the richness of a pie to the endless monotony of potatoes. The taste of sugar lingers for hours, a cruel and beautiful reminder that sweetness is the rarest flavor of all. Still, for one afternoon, you live at the moment. You let yourself believe in the magic, even as you watch the last of your coins disappear and the piles of treats shrink. You let your children eat until their cheeks are round and red, and you promise yourself that next year you'll save just a little more. By the time the sun sets, you're tired but satisfied, pockets empty but heart full. As the stalls pack up and the smells fade into memory, you gather with your family and savor every crumb, every sticky finger, every joke and memory spun around a bite of something special. Festival fare is more than just food. It's proof that even the hardest life can be sweet, if only for a day. And as you trudge home you tuck the memory away, a taste of hope to keep you going. Until the next miracle appears on the street. Kids in Victorian England don't play house, they play pretend dinner. A stick becomes a roast, muddy's a dessert, and imagination is the main course. Hunger turns even the simplest game into a feast, and sometimes the only thing getting full is your sense of creativity. For the children of Victorian peasants, hunger isn't just a background hum, it's the main character in every childhood story. Real meals are rare and precious, so playtime transforms into a rehearsal for the feasts of their dreams. On muddy backstreets and behind battered cottages, little ones gather for the daily ritual of make-believe banqueting. If you peek through a window or around the corner, you'll see tiny hands stirring imaginary pots, doing out invisible porridge and announcing with great pride tonight's special. Tree bark stew seasoned with dandelion fluff. The props are whatever's at hand. Sticks, stones, and tufts of moss are pressed into service as everything from Sunday roasts to bread rolls. Clumps of weeds are garnished and set out in cracked sauces, while an old tin lid might serve as a prized platter for the day's catch, a pebble. Wrapped in leaf artfully described as smoked fish. For dessert, mud pies are decorated with flower petals and bits of broken crockery, looking more appetizing than anything to be found in the real kitchen. The oldest child inevitably becomes the cook, orchestrating the action, making solemn pronouncements about the invisible meat stew and carefully measuring out portions of nothing. You get 2 spoonfuls, and you get 3 because you finished your chores. Siblings and friends gather around solemnly pretending to chew, sometimes smacking their lips or sighing with exaggerated contentment. It's a theater of wishful thinking, and every child is both star and audience. Sometimes the play gets competitive, who can build the biggest mud pie or find the smoothest stone for butter. Trades and bargains are struck, one perfect leaf for a slice of imaginary bread, or a handful of acorns in exchange for a pretend potato. Arguments break out over who gets the last crumb of pretend cake, resolved only when someone's mother yells that it's time to help with real chores or, with luck, for a real meal. Imagination doesn't stop when playtime ends. Bedtime stories are often about magical feasts and bottomless bowls of porridge served by fairies, giants, or kindly old women with secret gardens. Children drift to sleep full, if only, of dreams. They wake the next day to the familiar rumble of hunger and the game starts anew. The grown-ups watch all of this with a mixture of sadness and pride. They know that play is a shield against hunger, a way to stretch the mind when the body can't stretch another bite out of the ladder. Sometimes, if there's an actual scrap of food to spare, the line between game and reality blurs. A crust of bread is served with fanfare, a sliver of cheese is divided with ceremony and everyone pretends for a moment that it's a banquet worthy of royalty. But make no mistake, these games build more than just castles in the air. They forge resilience, empathy, and a sly resourcefulness that will last long after childhood has ended. Today's little chefs and make-believe bakers become tomorrow's survivors, people who know how to scrape by and make joy out of nothing at all. So next time you see a muddy-faced child serving a pebble on a broken plate, don't correct them, just smile and ask for seconds. After all, in Victorian England, a full imagination is sometimes the only kind of full you get, and for one moment, laughter and creativity can fill a belly. Better than even the best cabbage stew. So tonight, as you settle into your bed, a real bed with sheets that don't double as winter insulation and a pillow not made from hay, take a quiet moment to reflect on your journey through Victorian peasant cuisine. You survived a day of girl cabbage potatoes and the thrilling possibility that your dinner might fight back. You learned the delicate art of soaking stale bread, the courage it takes to bite into mysterious meat pie, and the resilience required to call boiled water tea. With a straight face in a world where leftovers meant survival in seconds was a rumor. Every meal was an exercise in creativity and compromise. You navigated the minefield of charity lines, rat raids and kitchen catastrophes with humor, stubbornness, and just a little bit of hope. The Victorian peasant wasn't just hungry. They were masters of making do, stretching scraps and finding small joys in a bowl of thin soup. And they did it all without Instagram to show off their plate or Uber Eats to bring them relief. So as you close your eyes tonight, let yourself feel a little gratitude for the warmth, the full belly and the miracle of not having to eat eel pie unless that's your thing. In which case good luck. Maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors, who made it through centuries of questionable stews and invented new ways to turn root vegetables into a lifestyle. Because history, for all its hunger and hardship, is really just proof that people are stubborn, hopeful and surprisingly resourceful. Tomorrow, when you open your fridge and complain there's nothing to eat, just remember at least it's not boiled cabbage and stale bread. Sleep well, dream of feasts and wake up grateful. Good night.